Now for a talk I've been looking forward to for a very long time. You probably remember Roger D. Silvestro. He's been here before. He's written that extraordinary book about Roosevelt in Roosevelt's time in North Dakota, which brings Hagedorn up to date and takes it to a much deeper level. And to introduce him is another one of our TR honors students, Nathan Magstadt of Dickinson.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nathan Magstead. I am a senior here at Dickinson State University, and I am born and raised Dickinson, North Dakota. I'm pursuing a degree in elementary education with a middle school endorsement in math and English, and also a minor in leadership. Today, I have been given the honor of introducing this morning's speaker. Roger D. Silvestro began writing when he was 7 years old. He has written 10 books covering a multiple of genres, ranging from fiction, history, 2 novels, and wildlife conservation. He is an active member in promoting the protection of wildlife for the future generation and is a senior editor at National Wildlife magazine. He has an online blog that covers topics ranging from wildlife benefits of acorns and oaks to how Les Miserables is a wildlife lesson. Before writing his highly acclaimed book, Theodore Roosevelt in the Badlands, D. Silvestro spent a summer on a ranch and had this to say about his experience. We would round up cows and brand their calves with glowing irons, amidst the odor of singed hair and burning flesh, in the way that disturbed one of Theodore Roosevelt's ranch hands. We kept rifles in a rack over the pickup's rear window and shot occasionally at some poor random beast that was not protected by law, a coyote perhaps, or a prairie dog. To paraphrase Roosevelt's comment on the open range, we felt the charm of ranch life, exulted in its abounding vigor and its bold, restless freedom, and felt sorrow for those who would never know what is perhaps the pleasantest, healthiest, and most exciting form of American experience. Roger D. Silvestro spoke here at this symposium in 2011, and we are thrilled to have him return and share more about Theodore Roosevelt with us. It is my honor to introduce to you Roger D. Silvestro.
Okay, well, thank you for sticking around this morning and spending some time with me and Theodore Roosevelt. My talk on TR's reading habits and preferences draws heavily on his own writing. You know, he had so many opinions even about himself, and he wrote them all down, which is very convenient for this sort of talk, because you can let him speak for himself, and I find he's usually more engaging than I am, so that's very helpful. So a certain percentage of this talk is in his own words. And those of you who are particularly familiar with the literature of Theodore Roosevelt may notice that I altered some of the quotes a little bit, for the sake of compression and for clarity. For example, where Roosevelt says book, I may change it to man-eating lion, and where he says read, I may change it to track down and kill. For example, Roosevelt said, at my home at Sagamore Hill, I always keep a man-eating lion by the front door so that I can track it down and kill it if my wife Edith is a little slow getting ready and leaves me waiting for her. I'm kidding, of course. Hope you know that. So you can unleash gales of laughter if you want to. I have compressed some of the quotes and changed some of his pronouns to nouns just for clarity. As for this comic book up here, that's from the Classics Illustrated biography of Theodore Roosevelt, which was called The Rough Rider. And it came out in 1958, the 100th anniversary of his birth. And it shows a famous incident here where Roosevelt went to a market and found the remains of a seal, which you can see down here and over here. And it was an important turning point in his life. And we're going to get to that immediately here. Theodore Roosevelt's zeal for reading began early, and at its earliest stage, his reading was linked with wildlife. He wrote in his autobiography, quote, "While I was still a small boy, I began to take an interest in natural history. I remember distinctly the first day that I started my career as a zoologist. I was walking up Broadway, and as I passed the market, I suddenly saw a dead seal laid out on a slab of wood. That seal filled me with every possible feeling of romance and adventure. I had already begun to read some of Mayne Reid's books and other boys' books of adventure, and I felt that this seal brought all those adventures in realistic fashion before me. I got the seal skull, and with two of my cousins promptly started what we ambitiously called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History." Now, Thomas Mayne Reid, which that was his full name, is worth pausing over because his books did have quite an effect on Theodore Roosevelt. Reid was born in 1818 in a small hamlet in Northern Ireland. His father was a senior clerk for the Presbyterian Church, and Mayne Reid himself studied for the ministry, but he just wasn't motivated to finish his degree. So he taught school for a little while, and then in December of 1839, he took a ship to New Orleans. By 1842, he'd found his way to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he began his literary career, writing both prose and poetry for the Pittsburgh Morning Chronicle. In the spring of 1843, he moved to Philadelphia, and he worked there for 3 years as a journalist, and he became a drinking buddy of Edgar Allan Poe, who was also one of Roosevelt's favorite writers, which I think is just kind of a cool connection. He fought in the Mexican-American War, and he also served there as a newspaper correspondent, so he's the sort of man of action Roosevelt probably would have liked even if Reid hadn't written books. But by 1850, Reid was back in London, and he published his first novel, The Rifled Rangers. He followed it in 1851 with The Scalp Hunters, in 1852 with a book called The Desert Home. These were all novels. And in 1853 with The Boy Hunters, which became a favorite of young Theodore Roosevelt. Reid died in London at the age of 65, but he remained a popular boys' writer for many years. Vladimir Nabokov actually, when he was 11 years old, translated one of Reid's books, The Headless Horseman, into French verse. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, credited Reid as one of his favorite writers as a boy and said he was a great influence on his own writing. Books are the greatest companions, Theodore Roosevelt once declared, and Mayne Reid's The Boy Hunters shows why he felt that way. The novel is about two boys from a frontier town who go on a hunt for a white buffalo. The story provided a model for Roosevelt, as we'll see in a minute. Basil, the hero of the story, quote, "is a mighty hunter. He is more fond of the chase than of anything else. He loves hunting for itself and delights in its dangers. He has gone beyond the age of bird catching and squirrel shooting. His ambition is not now to be satisfied with anything less exciting than a panther, bear, or a buffalo hunt," all of which Roosevelt himself would later hunt, of course. There's Roosevelt in one of his favorite suits. Now Basil, and you'll look at this picture as I described this, Basil wore a suit, quote, "that was all buckskin. He wore a hunting shirt with fringed cape, handsomely ornamented with beads. A belt fastened around the waist, was fastened around his waist, from which was suspended his hunting knife," and you can see Roosevelt's hunting knife here, was his hunting knife and sheath. He wore deerskin leggings and fringe down the seams, and moccasins upon his feet. His dress was just that of a backwoods hunter. For Roosevelt, the buckskin suit had a lot of significance. He saw this as the true American way of dressing. It was the garb that the wilderness settlers wore when they went into the woods in the East. And when he put on his own buckskin suit, which he had made right out here in the Badlands by a local woman, when he put on that suit, he felt he was taking on the guise of people like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, and also, quite likely, Basil the Boy Hunter. I really think the fact that Roosevelt mentions Mayne Reid in the context of that seal, I think, is a telling point. Because TR may also have borrowed another idea from the Boy Hunters. Basil and his brother live in a house with a hallway that, quote, "resembled a little museum with mounted birds and mammal skins and with insects under glass." So it resembled Roosevelt's own collection of natural history specimens that began with that seal. Now, Roosevelt read widely even as a child, so he wasn't limited to boys' adventure stories. In his autobiography, he wrote, There was very little effort made to compel me, with emphasis on compel, to read books. My father and mother having the good sense not to try to get me to read anything I did not like, unless it was in the way of study. I was given the chance to read books that they thought I ought to read, but if I did not like them, I was then given some other book that I did like. There were certain books that were taboo. For instance, I was not allowed to read dime novels. Now, dime novels were born just about the same time as Theodore Roosevelt. They first appeared in 1860, published by the Beatle brothers, who were sort of the original Beatles, and you can see them up top here in some of their early work there. The dime novels were a series of cheap paperbacks, and they were called Beatles dime novels. They ran about 100 pages each and were roughly the size of a paperback today. Of course, the books were priced at 10 cents, which was probably the equivalent of about $5 today. Given that the dime novels often used Western settings, they would seem a natural interest for young T.R. But you know, he was always kind of a moralist, and you sense this even in his childhood. In his autobiography, he wrote, although he wasn't supposed to read them, I obtained some surreptitiously and did read them, but I do not think that the enjoyment compensated for the feeling of guilt. I think that says a little something about it, a poor guilted child, you know. I was also forbidden to read the only one of Ouida's books which I wished to read, Under Two Flags. I did read it nevertheless, with greedy and fierce hope of coming on something unhealthy. But as a matter of fact, all the parts that might have seemed unhealthy to an older person made no impression on me whatever. I simply enjoyed in a rather confused way the general adventures. There we have a hunting scene on one of the dime novels. Now, as a fan of books about the frontier and hunting and so on, T.R. liked James Fenimore Cooper's novels, such as The Last of the Mohicans and The Deerslayer. He read Longfellow, and he especially liked the saga of King Olaf with its battles and fighting among the Norsemen. Such reading provided role models for T.R. In the autobiography, he wrote, from reading of the people I admired, ranging from the soldiers of Valley Forge and Morgan's riflemen to the heroes of my favorite stories, and from hearing of the feats performed by my southern forebears and kinsfolk, meaning the relatives on his mother's side, she was from Georgia, and from knowing my father, I had a great admiration for men who were fearless and who could hold their own in the world, and I had a great desire to be like them. During his first 10 years, Roosevelt, like many of his contemporaries, was influenced by this periodical, Our Young Folks. As a child, he thought it was, quote, the very best magazine in the world. In the late 1860s, and this is an 1866 cover, so it's possible that Roosevelt actually read this issue. In the late 1860s, the magazine featured a high percentage of stories and articles on natural history, outdoor life, manly enterprise, and womanly virtue. They were written to convey a moral, but still held the attention of young readers. Carlton Putnam, who wrote an excellent 1958 biography on T.R. called Theodore Roosevelt, The Formative Years, and which is actually available out there in the bookstore, thought that the material in Our Young Folks was rather overly sentimental and a bit cloying. But he did say, any child who loved and followed the cast in Our Young Folks absorbed enough sturdy principles, kind-heartedness, and natural lure to last a lifetime. And for T.R., the influence apparently did last a lifetime, because as late as his autobiography, he still thought that the publication had never been surpassed by any other magazine designed for old and young readers. In the autobiography, he wrote that the magazine taught me more than any of my textbooks. And in 1913, when the autobiography came out, he still occasionally reread old copies of the magazine that he had saved since childhood, and Edith had her own set of this magazine, which she had saved since she was a little girl. So I picture them both there at Sagamore Hill reading their old magazines. Roosevelt said, I really believe that I enjoy going over Our Young Folks now nearly as much as ever. He even admitted, at the risk of, quote, being deemed effeminate, that he had liked the girl stories and the way he'd worshipped little women and little men. And you may want to pause and contemplate an effeminate Theodore Roosevelt, which itself is kind of an amusing exercise. Reading is a sedentary activity that suggests an indoor life, but Theodore Roosevelt combined reading and the outdoors. In the autobiography, he wrote, there are men who love the out of doors who yet never open a book, and other men who love books, but to whom the great book of nature is a sealed volume. and the lines written therein blurred and illegible. Nevertheless, among those men whom I have known, the love of books and the love of outdoors in their highest expressions have usually gone hand in hand. It is an affectation for the man who is praising the outdoors to sneer at books. Usually the keenest appreciation of what is seen in nature is to be found in those who have also profited by the hoarded and recorded wisdom of their fellow men. T.R. mixed the outdoors and reading beginning in his younger years. When he and his ranch hands climbed into a rowboat in March of 1886 and headed downstream on the Little Missouri River out here in the Badlands in pursuit of thieves who had stolen another of Roosevelt's boats, he took books with him, of course. When you go in a posse, you naturally bring books with you. Dealing with dangerous ice floes and ice jams, as well as the 3 dangerous criminals he did manage to apprehend, he found time on the river to read Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and he read it in French. He later wrote to his sister Anna that he, quote, read it through with much more interest than I have any other novel, for I do not know how long. And this is another telling little comment from Roosevelt. Anna had a character so contradictory, unbalanced, melancholy, and fiercely passionate that she can hardly be received as being other than partially insane. He liked books that took him to places other than where he was when he read them, which might be why he was reading Anna Karenina while hunting down criminals in the Badlands. In A Book Lover's Holidays in the Open, he wrote, "When I lived much in cow camps, I often carried a volume of Swinburne, who's a poet, as a kind of antiseptic to alkali dust, tepid, muddy water, frying pan bread, sow-belly bacon, and the too infrequent washing of sweat-drenched clothing." By the time he was in the White House, T.R.'s extensive reading was becoming legendary, and his opinions about books were widely sought. Now and then I am asked as to what books a statesman should read, and my answer is poetry and novels, including short stories under the head of novels. I don't mean he should read only novels and modern poetry, but in the final event, the statesman and the publicist and the reformer and the agitator for new things and the upholder of what is good in old things all need more than anything else to know human nature, to know the needs of the human soul. And they will find this nature and these needs set forth as nowhere else by the great imaginative writers, whether of prose or of poetry. He liked poetry enough that he considered for a while editing 2 poetic anthologies, one of hymns and one of what he called profane literature. He was very open-minded in his choice of books and was not pedantic about which books should be read and which ignored. Books are almost as individual as friends, he wrote. There is no earthly use in laying down general laws about them. Some meet the needs of one person and some of another, and each person should be aware of the book lover's besetting sin, of what Mr. Edgar Allan Poe calls the mad pride of intellectuality, taking the shape of arrogant pity for the man who does not like the same kind of books. I am speaking of books that are meant to be read. Personally, granted that these books are decent and healthy, the one test to which I demand that they all submit is that of being interesting. He loathed best book lists of basically any kind, and I think this was a reaction to something that was going on at Harvard that time. The president of Harvard was putting together a list of something like the 100 books everyone should read, and if you read Roosevelt's comment on reading and literature in various places, he hammers on this theme of hating book lists. So it seems like it was kind of a personal little bug of his. He said that a book is good at one time or another according to what one is in the mood for, and the best 100 books of one person may differ from the best 100 of another and all be equally good. A book must be interesting to the particular reader at that particular time, but there are tens of thousands of interesting books, and some of them are sealed to some men and some are sealed to others. Some stir the soul at some given point of a man's life and yet convey no message at other times. The reader, the book lover, must meet his own needs without paying too much attention to what his neighbors say those needs should be. T.R., it should be obvious, didn't follow a reading plan. When he read about a particular subject, he would sometimes read a series of books on the same topic just because one led to another. But by and large, he said in 1904, I read very much at haphazard, and I am rather more apt to read old books than new ones. Although the old books I read are not necessarily in the least what would be called classics. He added, when I sit down to read, I find I am apt to take either old favorites or perfectly light but nice books like Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch. As we all know, he read with tremendous speed. He turned pages so fast that it was hard to believe he was actually reading them. But when asked about the content of a book, it was clear he had absorbed it. He would read whenever time and place allowed. He read while waiting for people in trains, and he read while riding on trains and steamboats, which he said were, quote, predestined through the ages as aids to the enjoyment of reading. He could read with intense concentration, becoming so absorbed, even in a room full of talking and laughing people, that he would be oblivious to what was going on around him. He usually carried a book with him when he went to the executive office building, keeping the book in reserve for the rare moments when he was free. He kept a book by the front door to his house in case he was stuck there waiting for Edith, as I mentioned earlier. During his 1914 exploration of South America, when he was too sick to hold himself up on his own, he would prop himself against a tree and read the Oxford Book of French Verse. In Africa, as we all are probably quite familiar, he carried with him a specially bound set of books covered in pigskin to keep off bloodstains and sweat and so on. He took quite a little library with him. I think he would have really valued a digital reader, because he could have taken a whole library with him, in one little form. He read Roman and Greek histories, envying those who could read them in the original languages. Reading history helped him get over disappointment with the present. For example, he said, if the attitude of the nation toward foreign affairs and military preparedness at the present day seems disheartening, a study of the first 15 years of the 19th century will at any rate give us whatever comfort we can extract from the fact that our great-grandfathers were no less foolish than we are. He also read Greek plays. What extraordinary people the Greeks were, he said after reading Electra in 1906, which of course is about a woman who ends up sleeping with her father. He said, I do not know whether most to admire the wonderful power and artistic beauty of the play or to shrink from the revolting nature of the theme. He could never let go of his moral base. He didn't like Sophocles or Marcus Aurelius because he thought they were a little had too strong a sense of futility. It's easy to, read the Stoics and say, well, are they Stoic or are they just, do they just give up easily? And apparently he went down on the side of giving up too easily. He liked Chaucer. Those scenes he considered obscene put him off. And he didn't like Shakespeare until he was in his 50s. I never really cared for more than one or two of his plays, Roosevelt said, but for some inexplicable reason, the sealed book was suddenly opened to me. He disliked some of the plays, but he reread most of them over and over again. He liked John Keats, the early 19th century English poet. He said that Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn and To Helen illustrated the very meaning of genius. Browning was his favorite poet. In a speech to the American Historical Society, Roosevelt said something that reflects again his sense of the importance of imaginative writing. Robert Browning was a real philosopher, and his writings have had 100-fold the circulation and the effect of those of any similar philosopher who wrote in prose, just because and only because what he wrote was not merely philosophy, but literature. He couldn't make himself read Jane Austen, which was an aversion he shared with Mark Twain, with whom he shared very few other opinions. He was a great fan of Dickens and often quoted him in his own writing. And given that he admired Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and H. Rider Haggard's novel She, which is about a white goddess living, an immortal white goddess living in the deserts of Africa, it's no surprise that T.R.'s ranking of Edgar Allan Poe as the foremost American writer would be a foregone conclusion. His sister Corinne wrote in her memoir, Poe's rhythm and curious, suggestive, melancholy quality of perfection affected strongly Theodore's imagination, and he placed Poe high in rank amongst the poets of his time. There's a real novelist for you there. Roosevelt liked Edna Ferber's Emma McChesney novels, which were about a divorced mother. This is kind of interesting. This is like in the early 1900s, and the heroine was a divorced woman, which were about a divorced mother who in 12 years rises from stenographer to partner in a petticoat company. After she remarries in the third volume in the series, she goes back to work and saves the company from bankruptcy. Ferber wrote more than 30 novels, including Showboat, Giant, and Cimarron. And if we don't remember them today for the books themselves, we certainly remember the films that were made from them. Giant was, I think, James Dean's last film, and he starred with Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor in that, And Showboat, of course, a famous musical. T.R. wrote Ferber about the 1915 Emma McChesney novel, quote, I wonder if you feel that I am hopelessly sentimental because my only objection to the last 12 pages is that I would have liked somehow to see not only the boy marry, the boy hero of the story. But poor Emma McChesney at last had the chance herself to marry somebody decent with whom she was in love. Now, obviously, Roosevelt liked happy endings, and he underscored this point in his autobiography. There is enough of horror and grimness and sordid squalor in real life with which an active man has to grapple. And when I turn to the world of literature, I do not care to study suffering unless for some sufficient purpose. It is only a very exceptional novel which I will read if he does not marry her. And even in exceptional novels, I must prefer this consummation. I am not defending my attitude, I am merely stating it. His wide-ranging reading habits and gregarious nature often turned his reading into action, as we can see in his responses to the reading of Leo Tolstoy, Western novelist Owen Wister, and poet Edward Arlington Robinson. As I said, Roosevelt was a moralist, so it's no surprise that he would say, I am old-fashioned or sentimental or something about books. Whenever I read one, I want, in the first place, to enjoy myself, and in the next place, to feel that I am a little better and not a little worse for having read it. His attitudes about books are revealed piquantly in a sort of running vendetta he had against Leo Tolstoy's The Kreutzer Sonata, one of Tolstoy's books. His comments about the novel were especially vehement, and they were also all over the place. It was like whenever he talked about books for a while, he brought up the Kreutzer Sonata. And it illustrates something about T.R.'s values and his sense of what is right in literature. In general, Roosevelt liked Tolstoy for his literary skill, but he didn't like his pacifism and thought that his attitude towards sex, as outlined in the Kreutzer Sonata, was unhealthy. Roosevelt wrote that the book has as its theme the idea that physical relations between a husband and wife are bestial and repellent, on par with those of a prostitute and her customer. T.R. believed that, quote, the love of the really happy husband and wife, not purged of passion, but with passion heatened to a white heat of intensity and purity and tenderness and consideration, and with many another feeling added thereto, is the loftiest and most ennobling influence that comes into the life of any man or woman, even loftier and more ennobling than wise and tender love for children. Never one to mince words, T.R. said the Kreutzer Sonata would appeal only to decadence and could only have sprung from a man who, however high he may stand in certain respects, has in him certain dreadful qualities of the moral pervert. And I almost expect Tolstoy to grimace, at the sound of these words in this photo, although it would be hard to tell probably. But T.R. said, it would be a bad thing indeed to accept Tolstoy as a guide in social and moral matters. It would also be a bad thing not to have Tolstoy, not to profit by the lofty side of his teachings. In A Book Lover's Holidays, in the open, he called Tolstoy, quote, an exceedingly unsafe moral advisor, thanks to the Kreutzer Sonata. He even says that if a reader likes the Kreutzer Sonata, he had better make up his mind that for pathological reasons he will be wise thereafter to avoid Tolstoy entirely, though he did allow that War and Peace and the Cossacks and Anna Karenina and Sebastopol and other of Tolstoy's works were well done and should be read. Now, as a man who resided in the West and worked as a rancher, T.R. loved books about the West, a preference that made him a fan and personal friend of Owen Wister, long before Wister became part of literary history with the 1902 publication of The Virginian, which is perhaps the first classic Western. It's the one that set the type for the laconic cowboy who says to the villains, smile when you say that. That line is actually in the book. It's amazing. In Wister's stories, a tenderfoot usually serves as the narrator, interpreting events from an outsider's perspective. Wister viewed the West not as uncivilized, but as pre-civilized, and sensed that the West he knew, the open-range cattle country, would vanish as farmers and families moved in. Wister wrote, Western life will slowly make room for Cheyennes, meaning the town of Cheyenne, for Cheyennes, Chicagos, and ultimately inland New Yorks, everything reduced to the same flat, prairie-like level of utilitarian civilization. T.R. thought much the same, and in the 1880s he wrote of how in a few years the ranches he knew in the Badlands would be superseded by farms. We know nothing quite so drastic has happened, I suppose, with the oil industry. We might wonder if it's on the way, but they were right, of course, that farming did take over much of the plains country. Like T.R., Owen Wister was a gentleman visitor to the West in the 1880s. As a young man, Wister wanted to be a musical composer, but his father forced him to study law, which Wister fully anticipated hating. And in fact, he was quite accurate in his prediction. He really did hate it. He hated working for financial firms in the East. And in 1885, He became conveniently ill, giving him an excuse in July of that year to take a train to Wyoming with plans to recover his health. He was immediately caught up in the Western life. He hunted deer, pronghorn, and grizzly bears, just like Roosevelt, and he socialized with cavalry officers and hobnobbed with cowboys, so it doesn't sound like he was too sick. In 1894, when he'd more or less given up law practice and was becoming a full-time writer, Wister recalled that the trips he made to the West up to that point were holidays from my perfunctory days at the office, the forgetting for a moment of a detested profession. Here's the Virginian. In 1895, Wister wrote an article about cowboys for Harper's Weekly. T.R. responded in a later issue of the magazine, revealing again through his reaction to books a great deal about his own values. He called Wister a teller of tales of strong men who dealt with the great problems of American existence and the infinite picturesqueness of our life as it has been and is being led. Grim, stalwart men stride through Wister's pages. Beauty, refinement, grace are excellent qualities in a man, as in a nation, but they come second to the great virile virtues, the virtues of courage, energy, and daring, the virtues which beseem a masterful race, a race fit to fill the forests, to build roads, to found commonwealth, to conquer continents, to overthrow armed enemies. It is about the men who can do such deeds that Mr. Wister writes. Roosevelt called Wister the foremost American man of letters, and he told Wister himself, "I really think you have done for the plainsmen and mountain men, the soldiers and frontiersmen and Indians, what nobody else but Bret Harte and Kipling could have done. And neither of them have sufficient knowledge to enable them to do it, even had they wished." Gary Cooper starred in one version, or maybe two versions of the Virginian. In 1902, the year the Virginian became an instant success. Wister was 42 years old and the nation's best-selling novelist. T.R. wrote to him a month after publication to tell him that the book is a remarkable novel. "If I were not president and therefore unable to be quoted, I should like nothing better than to write a review of it. I have read it all through with absorbed interest and have found myself looking forward to taking up the book again all through the time I have been at work." Now, T.R.'s interest in a writer could lead to practical measures. For example, he was a great fan of the poet Edward Arlington Robinson and gave him a government job with the understanding that he would do little government work and a lot of literary work. And Robinson wrote a poem called Richard Cory that you may be familiar with. It was about an industrialist, a wealthy and powerful man who commits suicide. And in the 1960s, Simon and Garfunkel, you may recall, Simon and Garfunkel released it as a song on one of their albums, and it's a great song. So Robinson certainly had lasting power in one form or another. So T.R. picked a good man to back, although at the time that Roosevelt put him to work, he had been having a lot of personal problems and was pretty much down and out. When Robinson's collection of poems, The Town Down the River, came out in 1910, it closed with a poem called The Revealer, Roosevelt. Robinson told T.R.'s son Kermit, "I don't know where I would be without your astonishing father. He fished me out of hell by the hair of my head, and so enabled me to get my last book together, and in all probability to get it published." Now, Roosevelt's reading made him a highly informed individual with a reputation for a vast store of knowledge. Said one acquaintance, it is to be supposed, seeing Colonel Roosevelt was human, that there must have been some fields in which he was ill-informed, but none of these came to my attention, nor, so far as I know, to the attention of any of my friends in the various spheres of scientific exploration. Lord Charnwood of England commented that certainly in this island, where statesmanship has long been associated with scholarly attainments, no statesman for centuries has had his width of intellectual range. Roosevelt, however, was modest about the knowledge he'd amassed. "I am not learned," T.R. told one acquaintance. "I know about some subjects which have interested me and which I have studied. Between them are immense gaps." This is the porch of his house at the Elkhorn Ranch at the north end of the park. It's gone now, of course, but he used to sit on that porch and read, and he liked to sit in the rocking chair that he had there. He said, "Rocking chair. Every American loves a rocking chair," because, everything had to have some sort of metaphorical value. And sometimes he would read to his cowboys history books and that sort of thing. He was always trying to get people to read. This is the Classics Illustrated version of Roosevelt sitting on the porch at the Elkhorn Ranch reading a book. We all know one of Roosevelt's great interests was nature, including both wild animals and wild places. He read extensively about wildlife and nature. Here we see him with John Burroughs. John Burroughs is in the black clothing with the hat in the back there. Burroughs was a leading conservationist of his time and a nature writer, and Roosevelt was a great fan of his and went with him to Yellowstone. And of course, we know that Roosevelt also wrote his own books about nature. There he is, I think, in South America, already working on the book before he even gets back. He wrote, of course, many articles and books and even scientific journals. His lifelong interest in reading and writing about nature lasted right up to his final moments. On the last day of his life, he wrote a review of a new book about pheasants. And that's where I think I will leave him and his reading habits there at the end of his life. And I want to thank you for your time and for listening. One quick moment of speculation that occurred to me while I was working on this, that I think Roosevelt would have been really thrilled today at the easy access to books. You know, going on to Amazon and you can find almost any title you want. Sometimes you can get them for a penny. And Google books. When I first heard of Roosevelt's sister's book, My Brother Theodore Roosevelt, I thought, oh, I have to get that. And I looked, Google books. 10 minutes later, I had a copy printed out. You know, I thought, you know, for Roosevelt, I think this would have been just amazing, for even that he was such a book fiend. You know, at any rate, that's just idle speculation. Thank you.
Take some questions.
Oh, sure.
Let's see.
Thank you.
That was just a fantastic lecture, and you know, I think everyone's thinking the same thing about this. Is if you had not mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, if we were at a Modern Language Association conference somewhere, and you were talking about this person who had read this much and had these thoughts and was constantly putting authors in his correspondence and fighting quarrels about their style and so on, we might think this was an eminent chair of a professor of English at Columbia or the University of Chicago or Stanford, or somebody who gave his whole life to being a man of letters. But of course, that's not true at all. Here's Roosevelt, who's riding broncs and engaged in polo and is the president of the United States and doing jujitsu and stick fighting and so on. How does a man or any human being find this much soul and energy when this alone would have been an incredible achievement for him?
I know, it is amazing. It's rare that you get a man of action who's also a person of literature or of sort of academia, I guess, but particularly of literature. And it's the same thing with Thomas Edward Lawrence. Lawrence of Arabia is oftentimes cited as the rare example of a man who's very literate and yet at the same time a man of action. And these people are so rare. I mean, who knows what makes that? And I suppose you could take Carlton Putnam's comment that Roosevelt was sickly as a child, and that, like many people who are more or less invalids when they're young, he really got into reading. But maybe his heart was really in the outdoors, so that in a sense his illness could have welded together those two aspects of his personality.
That's why Mayne Reid is so important, because a voluminous writer, kind of the sort of sense of Buffalo and Adventures and Skinners and Muleteers and so on, that this sickly boy is reading. They're fairly easy novels to read and short, and they seem to have really laid down a very powerful impression on Roosevelt's behavior in addition to his mind.
They did. And Mayne Reid, his books were full of inaccuracies about wildlife, and Roosevelt's father, when he found out he was reading these books, actually gave him some better books on nature, which he continued to value throughout his life. But still, Mayne Reid laid that groundwork, I guess.
So how did you research this paper? Because, as you know, this stuff is scattered through a very wide part of Roosevelt.
Well, it helped that I had done my own book, Theodore Roosevelt and the Badlands, because I had read about Mayne Reid then. In fact, I read The Boy Hunters. And, carrying around a book that says The Boy Hunters, it can make you nervous, In a place like Washington, it's like, so, but nevertheless, but I read that book, and I read some of the other material from his childhood, the things that he was dealing with. And then a very helpful book was one called The Seven Worlds of Theodore Roosevelt, which has a chapter in it just on his reading habits. So when I started working the speech, I started with that as the foundation. And then I went from there into Roosevelt's own works. And then Owen Wister wrote a memoir about Theodore Roosevelt, so that helped. You could go to those sorts of things. And also, Roosevelt just leaves such a huge paper trail. I mean, he's really made for a writer. I noticed this in writing Theodore Roosevelt in the Badlands. I went to the Badlands and I started trying to describe the scenery, and then I thought, why should I describe it? And Roosevelt already did it, and he did it really well, and he did it in the 1880s, which is the period I'm writing about. So Roosevelt is a great subject to, you can just let him write his own books, or your own books in this case.
And then, of course, in addition to reading incessantly, apparently a book a day, with having a near photographic memory, and engaging in all of the strenuous activities he did, he also writes 150,000 letters at least, and 40 books. I mean, that, if you did nothing else but write 40 books, that would be a lifetime. So I'm asking you again, I know there's no answer to this, but where does the time come from? Even not to forget the inspiration, where does the time come from?
Well, this is sort of speculation, somewhat idle, but that's kind of the best kind of speculation, I suppose. And I've thought about this, and also when you read about the colonial, the founding father types, the Jefferson and any of them really, and they were engaged in so many things. They were founding governments, and they read Latin, and they knew classical history, and our government is based very much on the Roman form of government. And then you get the TR with his vast interests, and I think, well, what is the difference? What is the time? What are the time constraints? And I thought, well, in Roosevelt's time, when you went home, there was total silence. You didn't have record players, you didn't have radios, you didn't have television, you didn't have anything there. The only way you could occupy your mind was to create something. You could play music, or you could paint, or you could write. And I really think that probably a lot of the electronics we have nowadays that enhance our lives and make them quite wonderful also just suck some of the energy out of, and certainly the productivity out of our lives.
That's certainly true, but I don't look at the collected works of Grover Cleveland.
That's true. That's true.
The others weren't doing this.
That's right. That's right.
They had a lot of time on their hands.
And I wonder how much of it too is that he was everyone who talked to him said he was a powerhouse, and clearly he had a different kind of personality. Like that comment about the fellow having to go home and wash the personality out of his clothing. And so you get this sense of someone who was just extremely dynamic. His energy levels must have been phenomenal.
And of course he married a reader. He always said that Edith was a better read, more discerning reader than he was, which is hard to believe.
And his first wife also shared a lot of his reading interests when they met.
We're going to start the panel here in just a minute, but questions at all for Roger D. Silvestro? Let's just shift them over. So let's do this question here from Nathan. Roosevelt reading religious texts.
Well, he certainly, he wrote a book called Fear God and Take Your Own Part, and he, It
had little to do with God, though.
It did. I had a copy of it, never read it. But, of course, that makes sense with Roosevelt. We can almost imagine that there wouldn't be room for God and Roosevelt in one book. But, I get a sense of him as, something of a moralist and a religiously aware man. But no, I don't really know that he delved into the texts or anything of that.
He was relatively non-practicing Christian. He did attend church, but people say that when he would attend church in Washington, D.C., he did it largely to sing the hymns, which he did very loudly and very badly. So let's gather up. Hal, come on up. And Steve Levine, if you're here, Stephen Levine, I don't see him at the moment, but let's just set up this panel here. Roger, you stay here too, please.
Yep, I'm just going to put this away.